Derek Weeks has spent his entire career teaching, educating, and fostering relationships. From his first job with Atari teaching people how to use its consoles, to his role today as a Vice President and DevOps advocate at Sonatype, Derek works to educate others. Derek joined IT Visionaries for conversations centered around the growth of the DevOps industry and how he is helping to grow that community through All Day DevOps, an online 24-hour conference featuring more than 100 speakers. Enjoy this episode. IT Visionaries is created by the team at mission.org and brought to you by the Salesforce Customer 360 platform, the #1 cloud platform for digital transformation of every experience. Build connected experience, empower every employee, and deliver continuous innovation with the customer at the center of everything you do. Learn more at salesforce.com/platform. This podcast is created by the team at mission.org.
Welcome to another episode of IT Visionaries. I'm Ian Faison, host of IT Visionaries, and today we are joined by special guest, Derek. What's going on?
Ian, really good to be here. Excited to talk to you.
Yeah, exciting to talk to you as well. We don't talk a ton about DevOps, or we haven't in a long time, so this will be fun to talk to you about that. And obviously your background. So let's get into it. How did you get started in technology in the first place?
Yeah, it's a good question. I'm actually a Silicon kid. So I grew up in Silicon Valley with Apple and other companies just down the street from me growing up. So all of my classmates kind of had kids working in or parents that were working in the technology sector, and we saw all these companies around. And I did my summer internships at Sun Microsystems for a number of years. My first job was actually with Atari, teaching people how to use personal computers. And that all started actually in 9th grade. That was my first job with Atari, was teaching people how to use computers there. And it was always just a fascinating market or environment for me. Growing up, my dad actually wasn't in technology, or he was in microbiology, which uses a lot of technology. But he always had this, scientific curiosity about him and asking questions of how things worked, why they worked, et cetera. So growing up in Silicon Valley as a kid, it's like, that's a computer. What's it do? How do you use it? What can you do? And I remember running around the labs and HP and Olivetti and other places in the early days and playing with things, banging on things over the weekend when we were allowed to go into those offices with some of the kids' parents around. And it just stuck with me. This is pretty cool. Let's hang out here for a while. And made a career of it.
That's incredible. I've not heard someone who started out their career in Atari doing it
in the 9th grade. Hey, it was kind of funny. I showed up to school. It was like the first day of 9th grade. I saw one of my friends I hadn't seen over the summer. I said, "Hey, Scott, what are you doing?" And he's like, "Oh, I'm working at Atari." I'm like, "What are you doing there?" He's like, "Well, these people are buying these personal computers for a couple $1,000s and they have no clue how to use them. And I know how to use them." I'm like, "I know how to use them." He's like, "Well, you can get a job there too." So I rode my bike down to Atari after school and I'm like, "Hey, Scott has a job. Can I work here too?" And they're like, "Yeah, you know how to use these things?" So it was kind of funny because I'm in 9th grade and I'm teaching adults how to use personal computers at the time. It was pretty, I'm sure they were looking cross-eyed at me like, "Who's teaching me how to use this thing?"
I mean, it's probably, similar folks probably did the same thing with iPhones and probably will continue to do. We did it with radios, did it with TVs. I'm sure, the pace of innovation always brings that, the kids who are early adopters so they can teach their parents how to use it.
I have been looked at cross-eyed from my kids being like, "Dad, hey, this is my technology. I know how to use it. You're old. Catch up."
So flash forward to today. Tell me about what you're working on, what it means to be a VP at Sonatype.
Yeah. So Sonatype, I've been at Sonatype for 7 years, and it has been a super great journey along the way. And the journey that we've been on and kind of the blue ocean that we were approaching, years ago is certainly still there and still feels new, but it feels 100 times bigger than it did when we started as a really small business way back when. And, it basically just feeds off of activity that's happening in the software development realm. So, at Sonatype, we do a variety of things to help software developers build better quality code, build it faster, build it more reliably. And as part of that, and what's happening today and what I saw 7 years ago joining was there are a lot of developers, the vast majority of developers around the world are using open source components and packages to build the software applications that they're responsible for. And one of the reasons why they're using so many open source components is they don't want to build code from scratch when they can download a package of code from the internet in a second for free that someone else with perhaps better expertise in that area has already built for them. And I remember that there were something like 13 million download requests of Java open source components from the Maven central repository that Sonatype happens to manage the year that I joined, which seemed like, oh my gosh, 13 million downloads of something? That's huge. There must be a massive interest in this kind of thing around the world. Last year, 2019, there were 246 billion downloads of these components around the world. There are only 9 or 10 million Java developers in the world. And if you look at the JavaScript realm in this area, there will be over 1 trillion downloads of JavaScript packages this year. And while the consumption of these open source components is increasing dramatically because it's accelerating innovation and allowing businesses to deliver more value faster, what we do know is not all of these components are created equal. So in the realm of Java packages that people are downloading, 10% of those are known vulnerable from the start. In JavaScript, 40 to 50% of those trillion packages being downloaded are either vulnerable or have vulnerable dependencies that come along with them. So it's really a matter of helping organizations understand, what are the good parts that they're using, what are the bad parts that they're using, and helping them quickly understand when they're choosing to use a bad part that there are good alternatives. And it really comes down to helping organizations manage their software supply chains. And so it's an exciting area when you see more and more open source being used and how much it accelerates innovation. But at the same time, we've seen a huge increase in cybersecurity risks, breaches that happen all over the place. And years ago, certainly Equifax fell into this camp of they had the world's largest breach associated with an open source component at the heart of it.
You also are the founder of All Day DevOps conference. How did that come about?
Yeah, so that's it's a good question. It was about 5 years ago. The other co-founder, Mark Miller, for All Day DevOps, and I were walking around a DevOps conference. This was probably the 25th conference that we had each attended around the industry that year. We speak at those conferences as well, and we meet other people who speak at conferences on a regular basis, and you kind of have this tribe of people that go from conferences to conferences, and you get to meet people there, in the hallway tracks effectively. So I'd run across 3 people from Intuit, 2 people from Lloyd's Banking Group, a person from Coca-Cola, and I'm talking to them about DevOps or DevSecOps and various practices or things that they've learned at the conference. And I'd always ask, well, if you're here from Coca-Cola or Lloyd's Banking Group, how many other people are back at the office in your DevOps practice or your development team? And it would be, hundreds, 3,000, 4,000, maybe more, depending on the organization that they represented. And I knew that there was a lot of interest and activity in the DevOps market with the number of conferences, meetups, and so forth that were going on. And yet not everyone had accessibility to the knowledge sharing and transfer that was happening at these conferences. So I turned to Mark. We had worked together at previous roles as well, our previous companies, and said, I think it's time we could do an online conference for the DevOps industry, and I bet we could get 1,000 people to show up. And 5 years ago in the DevOps market, 1,000 people showing up to a conference would be the biggest DevOps conference in the industry. So we reached out to a couple of other friends in the industry, some guys that still help us with the conference today, James, Karthik, Ernest, Shannon. And we said, let's put together a conference online. We'll run it for 15 hours across 15 time zones. We'll have 57 speakers. And we announced that we wanted to do this and we needed speakers, and 300 people signed up for this conference that we didn't even have speakers for, but they were like, that sounds like a cool idea. We ended up having 13,000 people attend the conference 90 days later when we ran it the first year. And since then, it's grown to what has been the largest virtual conference in the IT industry. In 2019, we ran our annual conference in November, and we had nearly 40,000 people participate in that conference. It runs 24 hours. We have 150 speakers, and that's really been a joy to see take off. And people just have immense pleasure participating in, because I think they learn a ton from the conference and the experience.
Yeah, and it really speaks to the rise of DevOps as an important critical piece of whether it's your IT infrastructure or your IT team, or whether it's your technology team, or wherever you park it in your company. I'm curious, what's the state of DevOps right now?
Well, I think DevOps is certainly reaching a greater maturity than it had 10 years ago when it started. And I think some of that is, if you look up DevOps conferences or meetups prior to the pandemic that we're all facing, there were conferences and meetups, multiple conferences and meetups a week, with people trying to learn more about it, what it was, how it works, what best practices are, et cetera. I think we've seen in the last number of years a lot of people adding DevOps to their titles, to be a DevOps engineer, even if they aren't really doing DevOps. But I think there are some organizations that have really strong DevOps practices and DevOps cultures, and they are benefiting dramatically from those in terms of the ability for people to work together, for people to have fun and enjoy the work that they're doing, for them to meet customer demands faster than the organization has ever been before, for them to be more competitive in the industry than ever before. But I still see that there's a lot of misunderstanding of what DevOps is and is not, especially for the people that are just getting into it and wanting to use it as a buzzword. And I think the biggest misconception in DevOps that people have is people really talk about or trying to understand DevOps as increased velocity of development. And while that is a attribute of what happens when you have good practices, it is not really the thing that you're striving to achieve. And that is, it's not just about velocity or automation. It's actually more about feedback loops in terms of doing things quickly. And if you develop a small bit of code and you can deploy that or build it, test it, deploy it into production, you can get very quick feedback loop to say that little bit is working or not working. And the feedback loop, when it's not working, says send it back to be fixed and correct it and get it back again. And that way you can do these multiple iterations with continuous feedback loops through that effort. And a lot of those feedback loops and information and monitoring and observing what's happening in the environment, critical to achieving a DevOps practice. But it's really also this culture of how people work together, a culture of trust, a culture of safety, a culture of open communication, a culture of we can all sit at the same table and get work done and collaborate with one another versus throwing things over the wall to a different silo within the organization. So I think, you can't mistake it for just automation, but you have to consider the mindset, the cultural shift that happens within organizations, and the collaboration that happens as a result. But I was just talking with some of my friends earlier, and my kids have gotten me into TikTok, which is a fun distraction sometimes. But I search on TikTok, like, what are people talking about with DevOps on TikTok, if they are talking about it at all on TikTok. And a lot of that perception out there from the few posts that were there were, hey, DevOps is just about moving things faster and doing faster software development. And I was kind enough to maybe respond back or reply back to some of those people saying, hey, it's a little broader than what you're defining it as, but it's a journey where we all learn, and it's worth going out there and finding the great content that's out there and the great people out there to help you learn.
Yeah. And so what do those DevOps leaders, where are they headed within organizations? Like, is their route to be, a CTO, a CIO? Like, how do they kind of build those skill sets and that kind of career pathing?
Yeah, I think like most management positions or executive positions, it's not so much wondering about what is the task that needs done or what is the tactic that needs run or accomplished. It's really taking a more holistic view of the business. So it's not just, can things move from development into production as quickly as possible? And are we monitoring the speed of that, the quality of that, the performance of that overall? But it plays into, what is the business trying to achieve, and can we achieve that faster? And how competitive are we in the market in doing so? Can we deliver value faster than our competitors and our peers? Can we meet our customer requirements faster? Can we be more profitable as a business in doing that? And I think it's really taking the things that DevOps practices offer and working with those in the organization and across the people in the organization to really give them a vision and manage toward that vision of what can we achieve and how do we want to perform as an overall business to kind of leave our legacy in this place. And I think that's really that more holistic view of what is the business and its people trying to achieve, and how do you assemble the right teams, create the right culture, or influence the culture and influence the practices sufficiently to get there. And I think that's what the leaders in the organization are trying to achieve. And I think those that are doing that are growing their businesses, are also looking at it as a advantage when it gets to hiring the right people with the right skill sets. When you're doing awesome things using awesome new technologies, and you have a culture that thrives and people are happy, they have the tools that they need to get their work done, et cetera, you're going to have an easier time recruiting, certainly in a market that is very competitive.
So moving on to security and DevSecOps, open source breaches have been on a decline, but what are some of the trends in the security space that you're seeing?
A couple of things in terms of trends. One is, when we talk about application security specifically, 5 years ago, when I was talking to people about application security, we were talking to people in the roles of application security. They lived on the security team. They had security in their title somewhere. They lived in that silo of the organization, and they often did not talk to software developers. Even though they were application security, they were finding problems in applications, identifying vulnerable code or vulnerabilities in the applications. And once they did that, then they would kind of throw it over the wall back to development and say, hey, we need something corrected here. We don't know what it is, or we don't know how to fix it per se. That's your job. But it was kind of a throw it over the wall exercise. I think today, certainly for the leading environment, it's much more of organizations that take a dev-centric or dev-first view of security when it comes to applications. So it's what do I know about the code that I am developing or code packages and components that I'm putting into my application that might have vulnerabilities, and do my development tools tell me about that? So if I'm using an Eclipse IDE or GitHub or a Jenkins continuous delivery server, can I be informed by those tools that I have security issues that need to be remediated, that are quickly telling me there are issues, here's a path to remediating those issues, and I can fix them without a security team ever seeing them and being involved. I was sitting or delivering a presentation in a application development meetup a couple of months ago. And one of the audience members said, hey, I just got a notification from GitHub on my pull request that there's a known vulnerability in the code that I just submitted. And now I have to go and fix it. And so here's a developer using a developer tool that's getting security information from his development tool environment, and it may be a security tool that he had integrated with GitHub, but that was very development centric. He didn't need a security team to review. He didn't even need to commit or integrate his code with other developers to get that feedback, and he was able to remediate it quickly. And I think that is going toward making a lot of moves to more quickly improve the quality of code that is being built. So I think that's one of the big things that has changed in the last number of years. You mentioned that there's been a decrease in open source related attacks, and I had previously mentioned Equifax, which that was a major breach, but there were 7 other companies and organizations that had the same Struts related breach Equifax had. They were just the ones that made the news, the biggest news with their breach. But even in our annual survey we've run for 7 years, this year 21% of developers say they've had an open source related breach in the last 12 months. 1 in 5 organizations having a known breach in the last 12 months is significant. Yeah. So even if that's going down from where it was 31%, that's still a big concern. And I think that the other thing is, we've talked a lot about the pace of development, but the other thing, the trend that we're seeing is the pace of adversary attacks. A decade ago, there was an IBM study that said the time between a vulnerability being discovered and exploited in the wild was 45 days. So if you had the vulnerability that was discovered in your applications, you had 45 days to race to remediate that risk before exploits were developed and adversaries could get at it. At the beginning of May this year, to show you how much times have changed, SaltStack, an open source project, had a known vulnerability discovered in its code earlier in the year. On April 29th, they released a notification to say, we have a vulnerability in our application. We have today released a safe version of that application with the vulnerabilities fixed. These are a super easy to exploit. So we recommend everyone update their application as quickly as possible. That was on a Wednesday afternoon. By Saturday, there were 15 breaches in the news or in GitHub discussion groups where people said, I've lost control of my systems. I have an exploit that's happening right now. We've had code executing on our systems that is not supposed to be executing. And by Sunday, there were 5 more. So there were 20 breaches that that I was able to see within 4 days of that vulnerability being announced. So the speed of adversaries saying, I've heard about this vulnerability, I can see the exploit, and I'm going to go and attack it and take over the servers, which is what they were doing, is much faster. So if you think it went from 45 days to 3 days, you have to think as an organization, when we hear of a new vulnerability, how long does it take us to hear about it? And how long does it take us to fix that vulnerability? And you could say, oh, it used to take us 3 months and now it only takes us a month. Well, if your adversaries are operating in a 3-day pace, you're 27 days behind. And I think that's part of the scary thing that you have to kind of be aware of is speed of security and DevSecOps. It can be an internal metric or measure. How fast are we at remediating vulnerabilities? But if you don't look at your external benchmarks in terms of what the adversaries are doing, it kind of doesn't matter what your internal benchmarks are.
Yeah, what are some best practices that you've seen, whether it's folks using Sonatype or others, for ways to mitigate that?
Yeah, so certainly with Sonatype, part of what we do with companies, we help them understand what open source components are you using where, and if they're bad ones, are there good ones available that you can work with. And so in the case of a new vulnerability coming out, we're getting that information to our customers as quickly as possible. And I remember back in 2017 around the Struts vulnerability that impacted Equifax, we had in terms of what we've seen with open source related use within our customers when a vulnerability comes out. In the case of Equifax, that vulnerability came out in March of 2017. Equifax discovered that they were breached through this vulnerable component in late July, I believe. So it took them a number of months to even recognize that there was a problem that they then had to respond to. And at other customers that we had at the time, those customers said, "Yep, we knew about the vulnerability. You alerted us about the vulnerability the same day that the vulnerability came out. We saw that we had systems in place that had vulnerable versions of that code. We took them offline. We sent those pieces of code or applications back to development. Our DevOps practice says that we can take new code and roll it out into production within 2 days. We followed our standard practices. Within 2 days, we had those systems updated with new code and back online in production." Other companies said, "Yeah, we saw the vulnerable code. We couldn't update it because those development teams don't exist on that legacy application anymore. It wasn't that critical of a system, so we just pulled it offline permanently." And they were able to avoid exploit in the wild by knowing exactly what was there. So I think there are organizations that are getting faster at responding. At the same time, their adversaries are getting faster at responding. So I think that's certainly a practice that's taking place more and more. I think the other thing that always excites me when I hear about it in terms of security practices and development teams is the red teaming efforts that are going on around different businesses. And that's, there's some great work going on at Intuit with the red teams where they have security pros sitting right next to their developers and attacking their code continuously, because a company like Intuit that holds so much sensitive financial information for their clients that knows that nation states are trying to attack it continuously. They are being attacked every single day of the year, probably every single minute of the year. And they know if they don't attack themselves and use the most sophisticated approaches to attack themselves and the most sophisticated tools to attack themselves and really find where the vulnerabilities are in their code, they know their adversaries will. So these kind of practices to build, security testing and red teaming, internally, that says we'd rather invest in doing this and knowing where our vulnerabilities are and having security people partner with developers to prevent those vulnerabilities from getting out into production to keep our systems even safer. And it's not just Intuit doing that, but they were certainly one of the leaders early on in doing that.
We've had some folks from government agencies on here in the past. How does this change for government agencies?
Yeah, it's a good question. I was just speaking a couple of weeks ago with Ron Ross. He is a fellow at the National Institute of Standards and Technology within the government. And NIST, if you don't know or follow what they're doing, they developed the secure software development framework, telling organizations or guiding organizations to these are really good practices for how to integrate security into your culture, your applications, your infrastructure, software supply chains, and guiding them toward, hey, things have really changed. Software is being developed a lot faster. There are more parties involved, certainly with third-party open source components being involved in building applications that we need to be aware of. We need to keep track of what those components are in applications, et cetera. And because our adversaries out there are moving quickly. So there's a lot of great work happening in places like NIST. There are also, there's a great amount of work happening across different government agencies, whether it's the Navy, the Air Force. Nick Shalon at the Air Force, who's the chief software officer, is doing some great work and really leading DevSecOps practices and culture across the organization and innovating fast. And I think that, a lot of us think of government as really behind, and if industry is doing it, then government's a decade behind that. And I think there are people like Nick Shalon that are really approaching DevSecOps on the leading edge of things. And I think even teaching enterprise how to do it. I think there are other things happening in the realm of NTIA, that's part of the Department of Commerce, I believe, working with the Food and Drug Administration, for instance. They know, software development has changed. They know software development has changed from the number of open source components that are being used in development. And they were working together with the FDA to say, hey, we need a bill of materials for every bit of software in medical devices that is being shipped out to consumers. And knowing if there are good components, if there are bad components, we need a list of ingredients of those components. If any of those go bad over time, then they need to be remediated quickly, or else people's health is at risk. And I remember probably 3 years ago, there was a note that went out to say, hey, there's a software vulnerability in this brand of pacemakers. And if you don't fix this problem, if you have this brand of pacemaker, you need to see your doctor immediately to get an update of the software in that pacemaker, or your health is at risk. And just thinking of my friend who has a pacemaker, what if you got that notice? How quickly do you need to get to your doctor and update that? But just having more awareness in terms of how software is built, how vulnerabilities are appearing in it, how fast adversaries are at exploiting that, how fast we are at being able to update those things. Government is doing a lot to set guidelines and set policy and establish frameworks for how things work in the new realm of software development. And so there's certainly a lot more work to do, but there's certainly evidence of really good work happening that's happened for years. And it has visibility at all levels nationally, whether that's the FDA, the White House, U.S. Congress, I know has considered legislation, and also national governments. Germany, France, the UK, and Australia have all passed national legislation or policies around cybersecurity and improving that, and especially tied to how software is being built.
Yeah, can you speak a little bit more about the supply chain stuff? Because that was something that I was really curious about. How DevOps and supply chain are so linked, and obviously it's one of the things that is one of your specialties.
So the software supply chain. So I write something and started writing something 6 years ago called the State of the Software Supply Chain Report. So we're now in our 6th year of writing it. I'm actually earlier today I was filling in more of the chapters within the latest report. And so software supply chains, you really have to think about it just as a normal supply chain in any other manufacturing industry. You have suppliers, you have warehouses of parts, you have factories that are demanding those parts, and they're putting those parts into products and shipping them to end users or consumers. Well, in software development, this works the same way. Think of an open source package or a container, a Docker container that is being created by someone or a group of people. They are a supplier. They then take that part and put it up in a public warehouse. And that public warehouse could be Maven Central for Java components, and the NPM repository for JavaScript components, Docker Hub for Docker containers, etc. And like I said earlier, there's going to be 1 trillion downloads of just JavaScript components this year from those warehouses by development teams. They're putting these components into applications that are then used by consumers out there. And in my study, I've looked at tens of thousands of applications that are using open source components. Generally, 80 to 90% of any application being built today, and in some industries like financial services, 95% or more of the application itself is built from this prepackaged code. So this is code that you've electively chosen not to develop yourself. But an organization, might have a couple hundred components on average in their applications. They rely, in general, an enterprise relies on about 2,500 to 3,500 different open source projects a year that are basically external suppliers of software code that you've chosen electively not to write yourself. But as you're sourcing these things, just as you would in any other supply chain, you have to ask yourself, who are the best suppliers out there? What are the highest quality parts out there? And how do we procure those and put those into our applications? So from a DevOps perspective, remember I said DevOps was about feedback loops. So feedback loops are, I've selected an open source component. I need feedback right away that tells me, is this good or is this bad? If it's bad, let me take corrective action quickly by identifying what are the good versions of that available. Now I put that into my application. I send it to our continuous integration platform. It's merged with other code from other developers. Is any of their code bad? Are any of them using bad components? If they are, what are the quick feedback loops that help us remediate those? When it goes into production, it may be, hey, everything was good when we shipped it. Now it's in production. Like SaltStack, a new vulnerability was just discovered. One, do we know what we used and where it is? So if we're using a vulnerable version of SaltStack or a vulnerable struts component or JSON component, what have you, we know exactly, hey, that JSON component is in 6 applications in production. It's now vulnerable. How quickly can we identify that and remediate that and use the feedback loops? And quick ability to identify the problems and quick ability to roll out new capabilities or new updates to that software in production to make sure we're not exploited. So there's this kind of idea of the software supply chains, like physical manufacturing supply chains, coupled with fast feedback loops and development and DevOps, DevSecOps practices that tie these together. But I think by looking at it as a supply chain and software supply chain, it's easier to imagine the flow of these components, the suppliers, and then being able to study, who are the best and were suppliers out there, what are the best parts out there. And that's a lot of the work that I've done over the years that I've been writing the State of the Software Supply Chain report. In the past couple of years, I've been lucky enough to partner with Gene Kim and Dr. Stephen McGill on some of that research, where we've identified exemplary or exemplar open source projects, the best suppliers out there. And this year we're focusing on exemplars in terms of the best developers out there, or the best practices within enterprises in terms of enterprise development.
Okay, let's get into our lightning round. These questions are fast and easy, just like the Salesforce Customer 360 platform, #1 cloud platform for digital transformation of every experience. You can go to salesforce.com/platform to learn more. We love Salesforce platform. They've been with us since the very beginning of this show. So check them out, salesforce.com/platform. Lightning round questions. Derek, are you ready?
I am totally ready.
#1, what hobby or habit have you picked up during shelter in place?
I bought a smoker, so I'm a proud owner of a Yoder smoker, and I'm smoking briskets and ribs and all of that. My kids are loving it.
I was going to ask you that as one of my questions. How did your first foray into brisket go?
We just cooked the first brisket. July 3rd, we had friends over because a family of four cannot eat a full brisket. You need to have a lot of friends around. And it was very tasty and juicy, and everyone went back for third. So I think that's the reviews were positive.
Do you have a hidden talent or passion?
Hidden talent or passion? Wine collecting is always a fun passion of mine on the side, and also doodling and art is also something fun that I have kept up with all my life.
Is there a speaker or a session or something that's coming up in All Day DevOps that that everybody needs to know about?
We haven't announced the speakers for this year, so it might be a little too early for that. But I will say, out of the all of the sessions from All Day DevOps in the previous 4 years that we've done it, 500 plus sessions are out there recorded online, available to everyone. There are two exceptional presentations from last year. The guys from Adidas that talk about their kind of DevOps Cup internally was this competition that they ran with different teams competing against each other with different DevOps practices or innovations that they were bringing, that I thought was a really cool story. And also the guys from State Farm did this great presentation on transforming a 97-year-old organization into a high velocity, new lean kind of software development practice. And they've had tremendous success there. So I really love hearing how people, overcome a lot in kind of older, traditional, maybe what's seen as stodgy from the outside organizations, but are really racing to transform internally.
Anything that you've been binge listening to or watching on the podcast, TV, or book front?
Ooh, gosh, there's so much that I listen to on a daily basis. What stands out in terms of a podcast? There was, I'm going to forget the name of this podcast, but there was a super interesting story that I remember listening to about how Facebook was using all of our data, and Facebook and Google and others, but just the access to the data that they have, and how the access to that data influences what they know about everyone, and how it creates filter bubbles that we all live within. So if I like dogs and barbecue, that's all I'm seeing. And I think everyone else in the world is talking about these things and loving these things. And the more you get into like, hey, I like wine, within a week you can be completely immersed in those environments because they're making that happen. But it was fascinating to kind of learn about these filter bubbles that are all created in our new online virtual environments because of the things that we like and follow and so forth, and how that kind of manipulates our behavior and understanding of things. But if you own all the data, like Facebook, they understand everything. They see the big picture and know, what's going on overall. So I just imagine that there are things like the 2020 election. They know what the votes are going to be ahead of, any polling out there, because, if you like Trump, you're only seeing Trump things. And if you like Biden, you're only seeing Biden things. They know how many people are following each and have a pretty good indication of the global scale of interest in those topics from different people. So it's fascinating stuff.
Yeah, it is really fascinating stuff. And I would add that what's so fascinating about it is that, like, when you get given somebody else's phone and all their apps are like all in a different place, and you're like, why do you like, this is really weird. I would be so curious to see, like, if we looked at our friends' feeds or our family's feeds, like what they're getting served constantly. But it is, I think, the intersection of like how people are sharing that content on like messaging apps, or Facebook owns WhatsApp, so that's another thing for them. But on all of the messaging apps, because I think it's so funny. That's how you get your input of new content, right? It's not from the algorithm sourcing you new things, because that's reinforcing the stuff that you already have. It's people sharing other things into that, which is really, really fascinating.
Yeah. So I just looked it up. It's the Making Sense podcast with Sam Harris that covered that topic. So if any of your listeners are looking for that interview, definitely worth diving into.
Yeah, that's great. Great recommendation. What would be your best advice for someone who's a DevOps leader?
Yeah, there's a book. Mark Schwartz speaks a lot in the DevOps industry, and he's written a number of books. One of which is called "A Seat at the Table," and I think the key thing that I keep coming to in a lot of conversations, and if you're a DevOps leader, you probably already know this, but for everyone else out there striving to be a better leader, it's the seat at the table. To me, really says if you're going to make DevOps happen and be successful as a culture, you need to sit and talk with people. Get that seat at the table or be at the table. And I think a lot of what doesn't happen or frustrations in organizations or obstacles people face is that they don't just sit down and talk to one another. They kind of observe things that are going on, or they're messaging people back and forth. And there's so much more that can be accomplished when you just pick up the phone and call someone, that can solve a lot of issues, that can accelerate the changes in things that you're doing more quickly and get people on the same page. So I always think of that, get a seat at the table, when part of that, especially in this world when we can't all be around the same table physically, is pick up the phone and talk to someone, because you'll probably make 100 times more headway than you would messaging them on Slack or sending email, or trying to interpret what's happening from afar.
What question do you never get asked that you wish you were asked more often?
What should I not work on? I think that's a really good question. People are very eager to start working on stuff, but they're not always willing to stop working on things. And so I constantly assess, is there something that I am doing that I just shouldn't be doing, because you don't have the time to do everything. So what should I stop working on?
Great advice. And I'll tell you, the one thing you should not stop working on is that brisket recipe, because I'm going to need some burn ends, because that is definitely, when I see you next, the expectation it has been met now. It took 15 hours to cook that brisket. And if something's going to take 15 hours, it better taste good coming off of the end. So that's definitely something I will strive to improve, because if you're going to put that much time and investment and money into buying the brisket, then it's worth having it pay off. A wise person once said, always improve your foxhole. And I feel like it's never been more true with brisket. Always areas to improve. Awesome. Derek, thanks so much for joining. This was great. Really, really insightful stuff. Everyone, if you're into DevOps, check out All Day DevOps, and obviously check out Sonatype. Any final thoughts? Anything to plug? Yeah, our next All Day DevOps, because you mentioned it, it's November 12th. We run 24 hours. We will have over 150 speakers be there. I do stay up all 24 hours. It is free, so you and the rest of your organization can attend. We have companies that have hundreds of people that register to all watch and participate together. And there are no vendor pitches allowed at the conference. So you're not going to log in and hear a bunch of people talking about their products that they want to sell you. It's just practitioners, thought leaders delivering super stuff. So November 12th, 24 hours, we kick off at 3 a.m. Eastern time. Awesome. Thanks, Derek. Take care. Thanks, Ian.
IT Visionaries is created by the team at mission.org and brought to you by the Salesforce Customer 360 platform, the #1 cloud platform for digital transformation of every experience. Build connected experience, empower every employee, and deliver continuous innovation with the customer at the center of everything you do. Learn more at salesforce.com/platform.